with vitriol, saying that they want Gaza turned into a parking lot, right? Imagine if I said that about Israelis.
Right. Of course. There would
imagine what would happen to me.
Yes. You would be excommunicated. And we should say, and before we get the emails, because I know every time this comes up, I just want to remind people that the supposed 98% of the West Bank that Arafat was offered at that time is the functional equivalent of me saying, you could have 98% of my house. I just keep the kitchen and the bathrooms. Well, enjoy living there because you have none of the infrastructure that is going to make that house functional in many respects. So, and
in fairness, it wasn't 98%, right? I mean, those numbers are actually not accurate. But your analogy is right. It would be given permission to stay in the house without any of the rights. You don't own the land, you don't own the roof, you don't own the infrastructure. It's permission to stay, just like the residents of Sheikh Jarrah have been given permission, but they're not looking for permission. These are their lands. This is a native population, right? This isn't a transient population. They belong on those lands. And so they're not looking to be replaced or to live elsewhere. They're looking to remain.
Remind people the situation in Gaza, when they start to send jets overhead in Gaza and bomb, and the inevitability of killing civilians and children. I mean, it's a foregone conclusion before the planes lift off.
That's correct.
They're going to do that. Just remind people what the situation in Gaza is like at this point.
So the Gaza Strip is about 365 square kilometers. It borders the Mediterranean Sea. It used to be a beautiful seaport and has been coveted by empires from the Roman Empire to the Ottoman Empire, who have fought over it as a primary seaport and also of strategic military interest. It also borders Egypt. It has 5 points of ingress and egress. 4 of the 5 are controlled by Israel. 1 of them is controlled by Egypt. It has been a greater site of resistance relative to the West Bank because it was under Egypt's rule from 1967 until 1993. And the Egyptian government, unlike the Jordanian monarchy, actually allowed for more Palestinian political activity. So Israel has regarded Gaza as a menace. And in 1993, slowly started to isolate the Gaza Strip from territorially and from the question of Palestine, and had a vision of making it into its own statelet rather than being part of the Palestinian state. So the first time we see a perimeter, an militarized perimeter around Gaza is in 1993. And since then, we've seen a policy of what Professor Sarah Roy has described as de-development. It's de-development and creating of dependence of the population so that they can't live on their own. These things come to a head in 2004, when Ariel Sharon, once again, offers to withdraw from the Gaza Strip, unilaterally remove some 12,000 settlers, which he then settles in the West Bank and says, now the occupation is over. But what they did is they removed the settlers and the settler infrastructure, but maintained effective control of the territory, and then literally declared war the next year. When Hamas comes into power in 2006, Israel with the United States then impose a naval siege and a land blockade on Gaza, which means that for 15 years now, the Palestinian population in Gaza has been under siege. They have been kept on a caloric diet. They have not been able to maintain hospitals because their electricity generators don't run. They are constantly in shortage of electric supplies. They live around the clock and have built schedules with when they're going to have electricity and lighting. Okay.
Yeah. Can you expand upon those conditions? Because I don't think a lot of the people who, even follow this casually understand. I mean, a majority of Palestinians don't have access to clean water. I mean, it is incredibly dire from a health perspective. So do you mind just giving some more examples about the occupied territories?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll give you one example just in terms of, cancer patients who need to get treatment. So they can't necessarily get treatment within the Gaza Strip because they need medicines that need to stay refrigerated. 1, if they get access to those medicines because of the siege, they can't access them. 2, once they access them, they don't necessarily have the electric generators. Israel targeted the electric generators in the 2014 onslaught. I mean, this is what I would describe as necropolitics, but perhaps that's too much. This is not an academic audience, so I'll just leave it there. But targeted the electric generators so that they can't maintain those medicines. Now, those children who might want to get cancer treatment have to apply for moving permits to travel to hospitals within Israel to be treated. Israel doesn't allow them to travel with their parents. So Palestinian children who are cancer patients cannot get their chemotherapy and their treatment in one of the most traumatic moments and scary moments of their life with their own parents because of the complete control over their lives, right? This, I'm giving you a tiny example just to, I think the one thing, if anything, I communicate to your audience is that there is a power disparity at play. And that power disparity cannot be whittled down to a conflict between two people who just can't understand. That's not the case. Israel is the 11th most significant military force in the world, the only nuclear power in the Middle East. It is an OECD member because of its robust economy, and it can actually control the movement of the Palestinian president. It can deny the Palestinian president from moving. There is no equivalence here. And the Gaza Strip is literally kept on the brink of non-life. It's bare living, and constantly subjected. Now, if Israel gave already named its operation against the Gaza Strip, which is very scary. It named it Operation Guardian of Walls. When Israel names its military onslaughts, it signals an impending gruesome offensive. I want to say it's probably going to be a massacre. I hope not. I hate saying that, but just to signal to folks, Palestinians are besieged. They are living on bare subsistence. Even if they wanted, they cannot become refugees of war if Israel becomes its onslaught. Israel will expand the buffer zone, and in order to protect its Israeli soldiers' lives, will then maintain primarily an aerial missile offensive where it can rain down missiles saying that it's targeting Hamas military weapons caches, but in fact, it's targeting Palestinian communities who have nowhere to hide. And then they tell us who are watching this, oh, but Hamas uses Palestinian human shields. And now you're stuck in the twilight zone of looking around and asking, wow, has it really come to this? Where even our humanity and our death become, even in that moment, we can't be victims and mourn ourselves. I was just in another interview and somebody wanted to ask me about Hamas rockets. And I really regretted not asking in response, who defends Palestinians? Right? Palestinians have asked multiple times for international peacekeeping operations. We need somebody. You don't want us to defend ourselves, fine. But we need something to defend us. And if you answer that question, maybe we can get somewhere. But the first response can't be to just condemn Palestinian responses.
That raises a good question. It's a little bit ahead of where I wanted to go, but let's just jump to the U.S. role in this. We just played a clip from Ned Price, who is the State Department spokesperson, who had been questioned yesterday about that question about do Palestinians have a right to defend themselves? And Price said, we believe that every state has the right to defend itself. And it was unclear whether he was forgetting that the Palestinians don't have a right to have a state, or if he was avoiding answering the question as to whether the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. Give me your assessment of Joe Biden and the administration's policy at this point, but also relative to the U.S. foreign policy regarding Israel and the Palestinians. Really, I don't know. I mean, I guess over the past 25 years, it seems to me there has been a real maybe this even from the Reagan era. We have seen the United States play less and less of a role of, or even attempting to play a role of an honest broker, right? Like I don't know at various points if it's fair to say that they ever were an honest broker, but to the extent that they're much less so now. And I think during the Bush administration, essentially it was, we're not playing that game anymore. We're not an honest broker. And so that role has been eliminated. And I think to a large extent, what we saw during the Bush administration too was they no longer functioned as a ballast to keep the Israelis from their worst excesses. And once the Bush administration said, "You guys go to town, go ahead," then the Israeli government, to the extent that there was anybody in the Israeli government that wanted to put the brakes on, had no excuse for their most, vicious of impulses. But give me your sense of that.
I think that's all incredibly on point. I do want to emphasize that the U.S. has never been an honest broker. Probably the last time that the United States was an honest broker vis-a-vis Palestinians was in the aftermath of the First World War, when they were seen as a counterweight to the British and the French, who wanted to maintain their colonial domination under the framework of the League of Nations mandate. That was probably the last time, and it was the Woodrow Wilson administration. But we've seen the U.S. steadily move, especially in the aftermath of the 1967 war, into the Middle East to fill the vacuum and to compete really with the Soviet Union in what was a Cold War at the time. That's when we see the U.S. initiate a policy of providing Israel with a qualitative military edge. That's where the unequivocal military support comes from, so that they can defeat singularly or collectively all the states of the Middle East should there be an attack, which is why Israel is the only nuclear power in the Middle East, which is why they maintain that it's a secret, an open secret, and are never pressured to sign the non-proliferation treaty in the way that, for example, we're seeing happen with Iran right now, right? So that's what the Lyndon B. Johnson administration initiates, this policy of qualitative military edge, as well as initiating a policy of the quid pro quo framework, which is land for peace, that Israel will maintain the territories that it occupied in 1967 in exchange for permanent peace. Except since then, what the United States has done is basically facilitated Israel's expansion. It's settler colonial expansion in Jerusalem, in Gaza, in the West Bank, and throughout within Israel as well, where Palestinians are still being removed, right? And at the other side of its mouth, it says, but we believe in a two-state solution and we want peace. And then we see the first Bush administration actually broker that peace. But when does Israel come to the table to even those peace negotiations? When the Bush administration said, we're not giving you funding. Because Israel cannot maintain this domination without an imperial broker, without financial, military, and diplomatic support. So no, it has not been an honest broker. The Oslo framework, and I can give you a whole lecture, I won't, is a trap that never, ever mentions that there will be a Palestinian state, only promises Palestinian autonomy. For folks who don't know, that would look like native reservations in North America. So if you think that native people in North America have a state and are sovereign, right, you can't. It doesn't exist. They're autonomous, which means that they have derivative sovereignty and are dependent on the United States. We live in a settler colony. And so what Israel has planned for Palestinians is what they're manifesting is to now concentrate Palestinians into areas A and B in the West Bank, to concentrate them also within Israel. They're mostly concentrated in the north and the Galilee, but we also see the largest concentration in the Gaza Strip. These are our current Bantustans and reservations. We have told people we are not in a conflict. We are in a struggle against our elimination. We would like to end this apartheid regime, and we need solidarity in order to do that.
You go ahead, Sam.
Oh, I just wanted to turn a little bit to the thesis of your book, Justice for Some. You argue as a human rights lawyer that this struggle, human rights legal action, more or less must be deployed, more or less in service of a larger political program of liberation. I hope that's a fair assessment.
Can you restate that? Let me get it again.
That human rights legal action must follow a programmatic strategy for liberation. And so give us a sense of what that means in theory, and then in practice, like what that program needs to be. And then I guess for the sake of our audience and what we can do in the context of the United States government to contribute to that program.
Sure. So most people, when they think of international law, it has a normative connotation of being somehow noble, that if international law prevails, then you're closer to utopia, right? But that's in my analysis and my critical theoretical approach